Thank you. Salam alaikum and salam sajatra and good afternoon. Now, this is all the slides you're going to get. I don't know about you. There's always pros and cons of giving these slide presentations, aren't there? So, one of the cons I think is as I'm talking, I'm suddenly realizing I didn't really want to say this. So I wanted to say something else. So, for better or worse, I didn't really know how I was going to tackle this workshop. It's not really a workshop. I think it's a sort of open-ended presentation. But then this morning, I found one of my favorites, some real chai tea, strong tea, and I managed to get it with fresh milk and no sugar, and that set my day off very well, and an uttapam, by the way. So I should introduce myself first, perhaps. So that's me. You can call me John. I have lots of names. I'm usually called Doc in Sabah. I'm come from Sabah, by the way. Okay, I'm going to give a bit of background to sort of set the scene, and then a few general comments, and then I want to focus on probably 3 species of wildlife. I arrived from UK into Malaysia, in Pahang, as it happens, in 1975, a long time ago. And as I'm now, some of you may have heard, I'm 70 years old, and one of the very few advantages of being of this era is that I've seen enormous paradigm shifts and changes. So just for example, when I lived in Pahang, to have any contact with the outside world, I'll come to Kuala Lumpur once a month. And I had to go through Temelo, those who know Temelo, where I had to check in with the police because there were supposedly communist terrorists in my study area. I was studying monkeys, by the way. But my main point is that it was a totally different, it was much nearer to the 1930s than it is to the 2020s, right? It was closer. And of course it was pre-digital in every way. So everything was 100% analog. And so why I say that is because paradigm shifts are important, and that will be the theme of what I'm saying. There needs to be a paradigm shift in wildlife management, I believe. Not only in Malaysia, in many countries, but Malaysia, where I've been now for 49 years, particularly so. A couple of particular points. So when I got into, as you might have guessed, as a young person, I got interested in wildlife in UK. And I can't quite remember because, you know, when you're young, you can remember incidents, but not exactly how you felt. But I sort of remember my interest in wildlife was much more on the artistic, wonder, ethical point of view. And I say that because a few years later, in 1980, some very worthy international organizations, amongst them WWF, that I was working for at that time, IUCN, UNDP, UNEP, they put out something called the World Conservation Strategy. By the way, I'm actually inspired by what you said earlier. I'm starting as a sort of next phase from what you, Prof. Fakor, said just now. So this World Conservation Strategy implicitly makes the purpose of conserving wildlife for human welfare. You conserve wildlife because of the role it can play in helping humans, which to me is nonsense, although it's widely accepted now. And I think we know this, right? So if to justify anything, including this ridiculous notion of conserving wildlife, it's supposed to have an economic purpose. It's quite good, huh? I think it fits with your worldview on life too. So that was one thing. And another was this. As a student in the early 1970s, the term wildlife conservation, it wasn't really there. Well, it was and it wasn't. The concept, at least amongst thinking biologists, was that if you want to deal with wildlife, you need to deal with management. And in our inevitable human-dominated world, there were 3 management problems to do with wildlife. 3 options. So one would be species were very rare and need to be helped to boost up numbers, which is what wildlife people tend to think of that now. But the much more dominant one, and the meaning of conservation, was actually something very different in that era. Remember, it's only 50 years ago. And it was you protect or look after wildlife because it's of its value. So even historically, if you go back in history, the sort of purpose usually of conserving wildlife was so you could hunt it and eat it, or in the Middle Ages, to shoot it just because you're the boss. And then tigers right up into the British era in Southeast Asia to shoot tigers just because you can. But the whole idea of wildlife conservation was things there that you manage for some sort of human benefit. And the other thing was wildlife management was if a species, if there's too many of them, you need to control them. You need to reduce the numbers. I'm going to come back to this later. Which is not how people see wildlife conservation or management now. Actually, I want to make this presentation somewhat interactive, and I don't know how interactive it can possibly be, because I'm a biologist. Most of you probably aren't, so you might be, to use a very good Malaysian word, blur. You might just think, what on earth is he talking about? And I've nominated Amat, Dr. Amat at the back, to be disruptive. If everyone else keeps quiet, you can disrupt me. Can anyone here describe what does conservation mean? This is a serious question because I don't know what it means. Anyone want to have a go? I'll give you 10 seconds or so. What is the meaning of conservation? 8 seconds, 9 seconds. Actually, what I find is that I really, this is almost philosophical. I have no idea what it means. I mean, we have a vague idea, but if you try to pin down what conservation is, it's very difficult to define it. Okay, that's my general opening, my memories from the 1970s. So I want to jump now to, the Malaysian situation. We're in Malaysia. So there's, apparently there's 28 federal or national ministries in Malaysia, lots of other agencies and state governments, 28 ministries. Only one deals with wildlife, and many of you would have heard from YB Nick Nazmi yesterday. And he has an enormous portfolio. He doesn't only have climate change, environment, mining, land, minerals and forestry, he also has wildlife. So it's perhaps not surprising that wildlife is sort of relegated to this sort of, oh, there's wildlife conservationists sort of can deal with that. So that's perhaps one of the reasons why, in my view, I'm inspired. I was inspired just now, actually, 1 hour ago. So if we imagine for a moment in Malaysia, there was no more health system for human health. At best, there might be Watson's or Guardian, and you can go and get some Panadol if you're feeling sick. And there might even be one of these, chain something clinic, I won't mention any names, where if your kid is feverish at 10 at night, you go there and you find a locum doctor who you've never seen before, never seen after. 80% chance he'll give you antibiotic and Panadol. So imagine that's all you could do, and there was no other health system, no research, nothing. And I'm a bit cynical, but I'd say that's how wildlife management is now. So in other words, there's a response. If a crocodile gets too near to town, public pressure will force the authority to go and shoot it. Or if elephants come into your estate, you may have a big hoo-ha. Someone talks about deforestation and then it's sort of forgotten about. So wildlife management, and I'd like to use this term wildlife management here, is in my view, an entirely reactive activity now. There's no system in place to manage populations. I think that's a key point I want to emphasize. And as you'll perhaps be realizing by now, let me put this down. I'm not going to give you a how to teach yourself how to manage problem wildlife. It's more, I'm urging you to have a sort of conceptual change. Whether we like it or not, humans are sort of in charge, and there needs to be some element of management in wildlife rather than conservation, whatever that means. So I'm now going to give you 3 examples of actually what my NGO, if you look at my biography, right, I operate a small NGO, Borneo Rhino Alliance in Sabah, based in Sabah. So the 3 examples are the one I alluded, or the 3 that I alluded to earlier. Either you haven't got enough of those animals and you're fearing they're going to go extinct, so someone has to do something about it. Or there's a population which is sort of okay, but you need to do some sort of management activities to keep that population in check. So it's in the right place, not too big, not too small. And the other one would be the one that is now considered very politically difficult or sensitive to talk about, is where numbers are too big and you need to push down the numbers because they're a disruptive species. So I'm going to start with the middle one, the middle sort of element of wildlife management, and I'm going to talk about elephants. Now I'm in my element. I like to talk about elephants. So again, if I think back to my first years in Malaysia, in Pahang, there were two things happened. So, well, first of all, what used to be called, in English, the game department, Jabatan Magastua, it was called. So you're puzzled about that. So in 1972, that wildlife, or that game department, was upgraded to what we now call Pelitan, Department of Wildlife and National Parks. And the newly appointed director, Mohammed Momin Khan, who's still alive, by the way, he said, okay, no more killing of elephants. Previously, if you have a problem with elephants, his rangers would go and shoot them. That was the method of controlling elephants up to 1972. So his stand was, which I very much admire him for, was no elephants will die. What we'll do is we'll translocate them. If there's a problem elephant, we'll set up a team and we'll catch the elephant and put it somewhere else. And that's pretty much, it happens not so often nowadays, but it's still there 50 years later. And the other thing in that era is FLDA, the Federal Land Development Authority, was in its highlight, heyday. And so FLDA, as you may, I'm sure you know, as mostly Malaysians, was actually a very important authority. One of Malaysia's big achievements, which was open up land for smallholders, those who didn't have the financial or even sort of general ability to open up land and plant, as it turned out, oil palm. So FLDA was in its heydays in the 1970s, and there was enormous expansion of oil palm in what was forest in that decade for oil palm in Pahang. And FLDA realized that elephants were a problem coming into the new oil palm, eating the oil palm. And they looked at, it's 50 years ago, so now, and the literature is not digitized, so you can't find it, but they put a lot of effort into finding out how to reduce elephant damage on oil palm. And their conclusion was there's all sorts of methods, like horrible tasting stuff, barriers, trenches. They turned up with electric fencing as the way to keep elephants out. And they were correct. That essentially that was the way to do it. And it's still used today, electrified fencing. But crucially, the 2 strands of wires need to have very short pulses of at least 10,000 volts. So if a mammal touches it, you'll be knocked back. And as you'll understand, it's actually ultimately it's emotional. It's a mental barrier, right? Elephants could still walk through anyway. It's just 2 bits of wire. So the concept behind it was that elephants will learn if they touch 2 wires that they see, they get a really nasty shock, and they'd never do it again. So those were the two elements of the elephants in that era, 1970s. One was no more killing. If they're a problem, we'll move them away. And the pairing or the complement was to put up electrified fencing. So if elephants move out the forest into the oil palm, they'd be shocked and they'd go back again. So many of you will know this sort of phrase of doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. And that's what I see with elephants. There's still translocation going on. We're not allowed to kill them anymore. And there's electrified fencing. So after 50 years, we're doing the same thing. But it hasn't solved any problem whatsoever. Elephants still breed and still come out into the oil palm, or worse, into villages. You're nodding, so you must have experience of it. So it's the elephant management is a case of doing the same thing again and again and expecting a different result. And what's surprising to me, no one is questioning this. Like, what's gone wrong? I mean, one way to do this would be to exterminate elephants. Probably 100 years ago, that would have been a viable policy. People would have accepted that. And if any of you know, there was a wildlife commission done in 1930 to 32. Surin knows that, right? Which is incredible. Imagine a wildlife commission 90 years ago. It spoke to about 700 people, Orang Asli, Malay, rural Malay, urban planters. And the results are exactly what you get today. There's some extremists who want to keep all the wildlife, those who want to slaughter it. So humans don't change. Anyway, coming back to the present era, elephant management isn't working. This sounds like a little plug for my NGO, which it is in a way, but it's not meant to be. So what my NGO, Bora, has been trying in Sabah for sort of 3 or 4 years now, I should mention an important point. Funding for the work I'm just going to tell you about initially came from Climate Government's Malaysia. They had something called the Hornbill Award, which you may know of. They've had 2, and my NGO incredibly won the first one in 2021. And that work has been sponsored subsequently this year by CIMB Foundation. Ina's here representing CIMB Foundation. So I wanted to get that, to me, quite actually important things, because to do work, you need to have gaji to pay the people who do it. A lot of people think we're volunteers, but actually in our 18 staff, people who used to be 20 years old 15 years ago are now grown men with families, so we have to pay them a salary. So anyway, we've tried to do 2 things. So, and we're not elephant experts. I mean, I perhaps should emphasize there are many elephant experts around. Where we're coming from is how to manage a problem rather than conserve things. That's our sort of thinking. So there's a couple of funny things about electric fencing I should mention. Peninsular Malaysia, I'm not sure. Maybe Ahmad or Surat know better than me. If you go to anywhere in Sabah where there's elephants, forest, and oil palm and electric fences, you find one of 3 things. You find either electric fencing which is working, or electric fencing which has been put up and not maintained, so it's not working. And then you find places with no electric fencing whatsoever. So in fact, the whole thing is a charade. It's a waste of time, right? If you don't have the system functioning in place, then you might as well not have any at all. And I think that's come about, there's many reasons. Cost is not one of them, in my opinion. It's because individual landowners are left to their own devices. That's sort of what it is. And the Wildlife Authority, I'm going to be a bit cautious here. In my view, what they should have started 40, 50 years ago is have a unit which makes people put up electric fencing, if necessary get grants from the federal government, or landowners do it, and have their own team making sure those fences are working all the time. But that never happened. It's up to random people to decide if they want to put up electric fencing. But there's another element to this elephant story, maybe the key one of all, which is that, I really want to provoke some interaction, but let me have it. Anyone like to guess how much food in weight an adult elephant needs to eat every day? So you've got one adult elephant. How many kilos of food does it need to eat a day? Just say, Benny? Huh? 100. Okay, it's 100. Yeah, I'll up you to 100. It's about 100 kilos, right? A couple of things there. I mean, small ones would eat less, right? And big ones would eat a bit more, but that's a good average. So you can imagine the volume. This is per day, right? Not per month or per year. The other thing about elephant biology, physiology, is that they have, unlike cows, for example, they have a simple stomach. So when they eat leaves, they focus on leaves and twigs that have minimal natural plant secondary compounds in. Some of you may not have done chemistry, so you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you pick any leaf, mostly it'll be horrible, bitter, fibrous, and not very nice. So elephants and many other mammals, they cannot physiologically afford to eat lots of one toxic thing. Partly there's a lot of fiber in it, or there's a lot of tannin or alkaloids, things that are not very good for your body. They can eat some, they definitely do, they eat all sorts of things in the forest. But the bulk of that 100 kilograms per day, thank you for guessing, very good guess, needs to come from plants that do not have these natural plant toxin chemicals in them. So I won't go too botanical, but there's a grouping of plants which have little or actually no toxin in them. They're basically fiber with a bit of minerals and a bit of protein, a bit of carbohydrate. So that would include bananas, grasses, palms, gingers, those sort of things. You can sort of get the idea, right? Grasses, palms, gingers, bananas. So it's perhaps not surprising that over the last 40, 50 years, elephants have become addicted to oil palm. And it's actually quite simple. It's not rocket science at all. So you have these hill forests. I mean, whether you're a human or an elephant, right, you don't really like to walk up and down hills every day. It's very tiring and you don't have the energy. So elephants, like most people, like flat land. The other thing about flat land, it's very fertile. The soils are much more fertile than the hill slopes. So from an elephant point of view, you see all this jungle full of bitter, horrible sort of stuff, right? You struggle to get a few twigs. And you see these thousands of hectares of oil palms there. Excellent food. So what I'd say now is any elephant in Malaysia that's under 40 years of age will know, it learned from its mum, go and eat oil palm. It knows that now. You don't have to say anything else. Go out and eat oil palm. And it's not really a physical, but it's almost an addiction. So young elephants know they need to go and eat oil palm. And as, again, you may realize that they tend to eat either young palms that are nice and tender and can be pushed over, or at the replanting, as I'm sure you know, 25 years old, the palms are cut and they fall over. A few years ago, they were just left like that, or they are poisoned, but now, the palms, that is, not the elephants. But now the general, the usual thing is excavators, the palms are cut down with chainsaw. And imagine there's millions of them, right? And Malaysia has tens of millions of oil palms. An excavator with a big chipping blade will go in and cut the trunks that have fallen down. And that's really nice because then you get a sort of whole array of wholesome biomass that's meant to break down and fertilize the soil. But elephants love that. If you go to Sabah, if you want to see an elephant, you listen for the Hitachi excavator, drive around, and you hear the chipping. You go there. Ben is laughing, you know that's right. You'll find elephants there. So elephants have learned to listen to this noise 2 kilometers away and go there, and they find recently freshly chipped, it's almost like sort of pizza shape, but really juicy, nice stuff that they can eat. But elephants, I better slow down. I better speed up a bit now. So elephants can also eat grass. They don't have to eat oil palm. They can eat grass. Now we think grass is everywhere, and it's because we drive along roads and there's grass, because local authorities don't have enough money to cut it. So there's grass everywhere. But there's no grass in the forests. It's not there, right? There shouldn't be anyway. There's almost no grass. So what one should think towards is getting elephants off their addiction to oil palms to be addicted to grass. Couple of points there. One important biological one is that grasses are pretty much the only plants in the world. If you destroy them, they grow back again, because all the growth is under the soil. So if elephants eat the grass will grow up again, unlike palms or trees or anything else. There's a fortuitous, good, pragmatic reason why I think one should encourage elephants out of the oil palm into grassland. As of now, forest departments, not surprisingly, do not allow grass to be planted in forest reserves. And in a way, one can see why. Historically, their role was to grow wood. And now, of course, we're in an era where planting trees to sequester carbon is a very popular thing to do. Nothing against it, it's fine. But the incentive for forest departments, I'm leaving aside the state government generally, forest departments, they do not allow planting of grass in forest reserves. So my NGO, we have approached several of the big oil palm growers. Maybe 10 or 20 years from now, they'll see the light. But as of now, not a single oil palm grower is willing to risk growing grass on their land. This goes back to the paradigm shift. I think it will come eventually. But let me summarize, because I want to go on to monkeys and tigers in a minute. So our NGO has been now, actually because of, oh goodness, 15 minutes, thank you. Actually because of climate governance in Malaysia, I had suddenly had this insight, and our grant from CGM 3 years ago. So we've developed, I guess it's sort of scattered around 20 hectares or so of grassland in eastern Sabah in something called Tabin Wildlife Reserve. And I say that, as you understand, it's an important point, right? So forest departments won't allow grass. The big landowners, of course, smallholders don't want to plant grass for elephants. It doesn't make any sense if you hand land. So experimentally, we have been able to plant grasses in Tabin Wildlife Reserve. Again, on deforested land, we're not allowed to cut down trees to plant grass, fair enough. And over 4 years now, there's signs of success. And I say signs of success because I'm very sure in my mind as a biologist that the idea of weaning elephants away from oil palm into where they're supposed to be, which in the future will be forest reserves and large oil palm grower land, largely, elephants could be kept where humans want them to be. Because the bulk of that 100 kilos a day, you could imagine 80 kilos of it on average could come from cultivated grass. So before I go on to the other two topics, just to mention a couple of other things. So we're also learning on the job in my NGO, planting grass. So one is we started with a few little insights. These are insights because I want to demonstrate what we do and what any of us do in any sphere has to have a big element of trial and error experimentation. And following plans specifically is not the best policy. Okay, so initially we planted an exotic grass. So this is 3 or 4 years ago, called Napier grass. I can't remember where it comes from. It's one of these pan-tropical grasses. And we chose it because in the literature, it's a favorite of cattle, and because the ratio of fiber and nutrient is very good, which is why cattle like it, right? So grasses, I should mention, by the way, there's about 150 species of grasses in Malaysia, not just one. They're as diverse as dipracarps or anything else. So two things there. So number one is we find that the biomass, the increment of biomass is as good as growing trees. So if you have good fertile soil, you can get something like 60 to 80 tons of grass per hectare per year, which is quite a lot. Of course, it has a lot of water, but basically the amount of biomass is as good as planting trees. So that was one sort of lesson. But my implication of that was 100 hectares of, this is very, very ballpark, but 100 hectares of grass, Napier grass, can support a whole herd of elephants. That's theoretical, not quite right, but you get the order of magnitude. In other words, you don't need tens of thousands of hectares of land. Hundreds of hectares, well placed, are going to be adequate to support whole herds of elephants. So that's one thing. Another strange thing we found, if you go along big rivers in Malaysia, probably not many of us do, I tend to do that as a biologist, but along big rivers, which are meandering, you tend to get two sorts of riverbank. This is before people came along. You either get a basically stable riverbank, where the top is above the flood level, covered in trees. This is a natural situation, I don't mean urban areas. And those bits of the river, the floodplain, tend to get eroded away. So at any one time, you're going along the river, you see quite a steep bank, and then trees on the top. Usually those are eroding. The water is always eroding that, so you see a slow process of loss of that sort of side habitat. And on the other bank, you get accretion, meaning all that sort of sediment gets transported around and it slows down and it settles down. So you get in the curves in the river, you get accretion, and on those accretion, before trees start to grow, you get grass, natural native grass. So what we found only literally in the last 6 months in Sabah is that what looks to be one species of grass are actually two. So I won't give you the names. If you're interested, come and talk to me later. So one species of grass is about 95% of this riverside grass, 95%. It's called prapa locally. Elephants don't like it. And 5% is the one they really like, which is actually a wild relative of sugarcane. It's not sugarcane, but it's a non-sweet wild relative. So our speculation is that elephants eat the one they like. So the dominant one, the one they don't like, has been expanding and expanding. So we've just started experimentally with cutting the one they don't like and making biochar out of it. I won't go there, I'll just leave it with you. So biochar, as you may know, it's one of those sort of topics that come and go. It's sort of famous and popular in certain circles now. You can either dig it into soil and improve the structure of the soil, or if you want, you can burn it as well, kind of fuel. But of course, in our modern era, the preference is to leave it as it is, as a sequestering device for carbon. I'm going to leave it at that because I've probably only got 10 minutes now. But I think that what I want to mention several things here, right? So there's a misunderstanding or misapprehension that elephants are endangered. Actually, they're not really. The issue in my mind is there's no management regime in place. And rather than translocating them or hoping that electric fences will work when they don't, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, one needs a paradigm shift. So how do you keep elephants where you would like them to be? And maybe how then do you have a system, big-scale system of electrified fencing to keep them in that area so they stay there and don't need to or want to come out because there's not enough food there. Next one, in view of time, I'm going to jump to the more controversial one in case I run out of time. Oh God, it's only 5 minutes left. Okay, I'm going to go to monkeys in that case. We'll leave out tigers. You can read about tigers later. So when I got 3 daughters and a son, so one of the daughters, and we lived in Kota Kinabalu, she came to University Malaya in the late 1990s. And that was on the intervening. We didn't have mobile phones, at least I didn't. But I phoned her to find out how she was getting on. And she said, everything's okay, but it's the monkeys. Yeah. There's a University Malaya campus in Lembah Pantai, right? So they come in and they steal my underwear, they steal my food, right? This is my only big headache. So I give that as an example. Monkeys are a big headache, but it's sort of the elephant in the room in the sense that people don't want to talk about there's being too many monkeys around. It's easy to demonize macaque monkeys, kera, brok, the macaque, the naughty ones, right? But the fact is they're a reservoir of the commonest malaria in Sabah, Plasmodium nalgae, which is what humans get, but that actually comes from monkeys. And those monkeys don't really like forest. Actually, if you know the kera and the brok, they actually like forest edge. They're not really forest-dwelling animals. They're very much opportunists. So in oil palm, they eat oil palm fruits. If it's off-season, they'll eat grass and insects. They're very opportunistic animals that can sort of go anywhere if you leave them on their own. And people do leave them on their own. Kinabatangan Wildlife Sanctuary, briefly, very brief, wildlife sanctuary in eastern Sabah, which I was very much involved in establishing in the 1980s and 90s. The biggest threat, well, there's 2 big threats to that sanctuary. One is it's in a floodplain, so the drainage from the oil palm goes into the sanctuary in the forest. So we're not worried about pesticides, no. The worry is that more water goes into the sanctuary than it used to, if you understand what I'm saying, right? So there's drainage in the oil palm, goes into the sanctuary. The sanctuary is under water longer than it would have been. So the forests are sort of dying slowly over decades because they're too wet. The other biggest threat are macaque monkeys. And if you understand what I've just told you about them, right? So every bird's nest will never survive. They will eat the eggs or the hatchlings. Even if there's nothing in the nest, they pull it off and look at it and throw it on the ground. Orangutans are sat there being stressed by 100 macaques which are running around eating their food. So I say it's easy to demonize macaques, but they're after human beings ourselves, they're in many circumstances a significant threat to integrity of ecosystems and biodiversity. So I'm going to say the words which no one wants to say, which the numbers need to be brought down very drastically. Can I have another 4 minutes? Oh, you're busy. No. Oh, goodness. Okay. What can? Okay, thank you. 4 or 5 minutes. So, and I've had this discussion with other people, right? So let us accept that it would be a good idea. You may not agree, but let us accept that it would be a good idea to reduce the number of monkeys. Not kill them all off, but whereas you might have 1,000 in one area, literally some areas have 1,000 monkeys, you might want to bring it down to 50 to 100. Genetic diversity is still there. You don't need to worry about the species. The only issue is animal welfare, I think. So there's several options. One option is to do nothing, which is the commonest option now. The other option is to cull them, which is a polite way of saying killing them. Now, I don't know if you know, but the Wildlife Authority kills about 60,000 macaque monkeys every year. I don't know if you know that. It's in public domain. And everyone is shocked, right? But the thing is, the number of monkeys is the same. So if you kill 60,000 monkeys a year, it just frees up space for them to breed. So killing them is not necessarily the best idea. Plus, there's a lot of people who don't like it. The other one, which sadly seems to be the WWF view, which I strongly disagree with, is translocate them. Remember, like the elephants, right? You catch monkeys and you put them elsewhere. In view of time constraints, I'm not going to ask you why that's the worst option. Probably some of you are smiling so you can guess. So number one is you take out those monkeys, the land and the fruit is still there, so they're going to breed and the numbers are going to go up again. And then you just transfer a problem from one place to another. And many people have this problem, but they're too scared to say anything. Translocation of monkeys from one place to another place, then the problem moves. Okay, I'm gonna have to round down now. So, can anyone think, if no one else is going to say, what do you think is the other option, maybe the sensible, politically acceptable option? He's doing that. So it's not circumcision, it's worse than that. Contraception, yeah, contraception. And it may be that some of you here don't agree what to do. I'm going to just say it anyway. So the thing is, it's not that easy to catch monkeys. They're very savvy, right? But you can. It's not impossible. Not impossible is what I'm getting at. So my colleague in my NGO, Dr. Zainal Zahari Zainuddin, is a very experienced veterinarian. He's got it down to 3 minutes now to give the snip. What's the proper word? Vasectomy. Vasectomize macaques. 3 minutes per animal, as long as it's in his sedation table, right? So it's not impossible to imagine a team, probably under the Wildlife Authority, whose sole job is to go and vasectomize male macaque monkeys. Neuter? You could call it, I think it's terminology. But I'm thinking particularly males, right, to snap the vas deferens. Okay, thank you. Anyway, in a way, I gave these examples of the bigger picture. So there are not rocket science they're not rocket science methods to manage wildlife with net benefits to people and other species alike, which is why I gave the macaque example. And I think I'm going to leave it there. But just to summarize, I think when you hear of human-wildlife conflict, again, and even many of my colleagues in this line have to say they think of this short-term reactive response, which has been going on for decades, and we should endorse, we can't do it ourselves, but we should endorse a paradigm shift where managing human-wildlife conflict is translated into management of wildlife in ways that are ethically good, acceptable, let's say, ethically acceptable, doable, not very costly, could be done, and thinking in a systems way, which goes back to my very first example of a national health service. We rely ultimately on a national health service rather than going to Watson's at 10 o'clock at night to buy the Panadol. Thank you for your patience. I'm going to leave it at that. If Madam, I forgot your name, sorry. Do we leave any time for questions, or we need to go on to the next batch? Oh, God, all right, okay. Come and talk to me later in that case. Thanks for your patience.